First World War was supposed to be the war to end all wars. It was a conflict so brutal, so utterly devastating, that the world thought humanity could never do it again. Nearly 10 million soldiers and a million civilians perished, bringing the total death toll to around 20 million. When the guns finally went silent on 11th of November 1918, you could practically feel the world breathe a sigh of relief. Everyone craved a lasting peace, a final settlement to make sure a catastrophe like that was impossible ever again. And they got one. It was signed in a glittering hall of mirrors and called the Treaty of Versailles. But what if that very document designed to secure peace forever was actually a ticking time bomb? What if the treaty that officially ended the Great War was the one thing that guaranteed a second, even deadlier conflict? The Treaty of Versailles was meant to build a new world. Instead, it planted seeds of resentment that would sprout into a thirst for revenge, paving the way for the rise of Adolf Hitler. This isn't just a story of how one war ended, it's a story of a 20-year truce. To see how it all went so wrong, we have to go back to January 1919. The leaders of the victorious Allies gathered in Paris to draw the new map of the world. In the room you had this strange mix of high-minded idealism and a raw hunger for payback. The peace was mainly shaped by the Big Four: Woodrow Wilson of the US, David Lloyd George of Great Britain, Georges Clemenceau of France, and Vittorio Orlando of Italy. But the core argument really came down to the three conflicting visions. Woodrow Wilson was the idealist. He had brought America into the war late, and he showed up with his 14 points for a just peace. The heart of his plan was a League of Nations, where countries could talk out their problems instead of shooting over them. Wilson had once called for a peace without victory, convinced that only a fair settlement would stick. He worried that crushing Germany would just create a cycle of bitterness. Georges Clemenceau of France had zero time for that. They called him the Tiger, and he'd seen Germany invade his country twice in his own lifetime. France was in ruins, and a generation of its young men was gone. For Clemenceau, it was all about one thing: security. He wanted to cripple Germany so it could never ever threaten France again. He demanded huge payments, massive land concessions, and a complete gutting of Germany's military. And then there was Britain's David Lloyd George, stuck somewhere in the middle. Back home, the British public was screaming for revenge, with slogans like "Hang the Kaiser." But Lloyd George was a pragmatist. He knew that a bankrupted Germany would wreck Europe's economy, and that was bad for business. He wanted Germany to pay, but not to the point where it collapsed entirely. These three clashing agendas meant the final treaty was a messy compromise. But there was one huge glaring problem. Germany wasn't there. The terms weren't negotiated with Germany. They were dictated to Germany. For Germans, this wasn't peace. They called it the diktat, a dictated peace, and that feeling of humiliation would become a powerful weapon for anyone who wanted to burn the whole thing down. The final treaty was handed to the Germans in May 1919. They signed it on 28th of June in the Hall of Mirrors at Versailles, the exact same spot where the German Empire had been declared back in 1871. The symbolism was as subtle as a punch to the face. The terms were far harsher than anyone in Germany expected. First, the most infamous part, Article 231, the War Guilt Clause. This forced Germany to accept responsibility for all the loss and damage caused by the aggression of Germany and her allies. Legally, this was the justification for making Germany pay, but to the German people, it was a national disgrace. They didn't see themselves as the sole villains in a war that had been a chaotic mess of alliances and ambitions all over Europe. This one article fostered a deep, burning sense of injustice. Second, the bill came due. The final reparations figure was set in 1921 at an astronomical 132 billion gold marks, equal to about $32 billion at the time. Germany's economy was already shattered, and there was no way it could afford this. Economists like John Maynard Keynes, a British delegate who quit in protest, warned that the payments would destroy Germany's economy and create massive instability. He was right. Third, the territorial losses. Germany lost 13% of its European land and all of its overseas colonies. The industrial heartland of Alsace-Lorraine went back to France. New borders put millions of ethnic Germans into newly created countries like Poland and Czechoslovakia. To give Poland access to the sea, the treaty carved out a Polish corridor that cut off East Prussia from the rest of Germany. These weren't just lines on a map, they were economic arteries. Germany lost huge amounts of its industrial resources, including control of the vital Saar coalfields and Upper Silesian industry, making it even harder to pay the reparations. Fourth, the military was neutered. Germany's powerful army was capped at just 100,000 men. Conscription was banned, and it was forbidden from having an air force, submarines or tanks. The Rhineland, its industrial buffer with France, was to be permanently demilitarized. For a nation that took immense pride in its military tradition, this was the ultimate humiliation, making it feel weak and vulnerable. In the end, nobody was happy. The French thought it wasn't harsh enough. The Americans refused to ratify it and never joined the League of Nations. And for Germany, it was a national travesty. The treaty didn't cripple Germany forever, but it made it incredibly angry. It was a perfect storm of economic pain and national shame, just waiting for someone to exploit it. The brand new German democracy forced to sign this treaty was called the Weimar Republic. From its first day, it was tied to defeat and humiliation, an association that would ultimately be fatal. Right away, a poisonous lie started to spread, the stab in the back myth. This conspiracy theory claimed the German army was never actually defeated. Instead, it was betrayed by weak, treacherous politicians back home. Socialists, Democrats and Jews who signed the treaty. It was a total fantasy. By late 1918, the German army was collapsing, but the myth was a simple, powerful excuse that let the military off the hook and blamed the new democracy. This political poison was soon mixed with an economic nightmare, hyperinflation. To pay striking workers after France and Belgium occupied the industrial Ruhr region in 1923, the government just started printing money. The result was one of the most spectacular economic collapses in history. The German mark became worthless. Life savings vanished overnight. People hauled money around in wheelbarrows, not because they were rich, but because it took billions of marks to buy a loaf of bread. This destroyed all faith in the government and in democracy itself. The brief stability that returned in the mid-1920s couldn't erase the psychological scars. People were terrified of economic chaos and deeply distrustful of the Republic. They started to crave a strong leader, someone who would tear up the treaty, restore order and give them back their national pride. The ground was now perfectly prepared for extremism. Into the mess of humiliation and despair stepped Adolf Hitler and his Nazi party. In the early 1920s, they were just another fringe group, but Hitler was a master of channeling public rage. His entire platform was built on smashing the Treaty of Versailles. He promised to tear up the shameful treaty, rebuild the army, and make Germany great again. It was a message that resonated deeply with millions of Germans who felt victimized. His Nazi ideology was a toxic cocktail of extreme nationalism, militarism, and racist hatred that scapegoated Jewish people for all of Germany's problems. He offered simple, hateful answers, and in a time of chaos, those answers were dangerously seductive. For most of the 20s, the Nazis were a fringe party. Then the second hammer blow fell, the Great Depression. The 1929 Wall Street crash triggered a global crisis, and American loans propping up Germany's economy were recalled. The effect was instant and catastrophic. Unemployment soared past 30%. This was the moment Hitler was waiting for. Desperation breeds extremism. Voters fled the moderate parties and flocked to the Nazis, who promised work, bread and pride. On 30th of January 1933, just 14 years after the treaty was signed, Adolf Hitler was appointed Chancellor of Germany. The man who swore to destroy the Versailles Peace was now in power. Once in power, Hitler moved fast. He dismantled democracy, crushed his opponents, and began a massive, illegal rearmament program, all in direct violation of the treaty. So the big question is, why didn't anyone stop him? The answer is a policy that has become a synonym for failure: appeasement. Leaders in Britain and France were terrified of starting another war. The memory of the trenches was just too fresh. On top of that, some of them secretly felt the Versailles Treaty had been too harsh and that Germany had a point. Finally, the Great Depression had wrecked their own economies and militaries. They just weren't ready for a fight. So they appeased. In 1935, Hitler announced a new German air force and brought back conscription. The world protested but did nothing. In 1936, he marched troops into the demilitarized Rhineland. It was a huge bluff. Hitler himself later said if France had moved against him, he would have had to retreat in disgrace. But France, paralysed and without British backup, did nothing. The pattern continued. In 1938, Hitler annexed Austria later that year. He demanded a German-speaking part of Czechoslovakia. At the now infamous Munich conference, Britain and France gave it to him in exchange for a promise of peace. The British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, returned home declaring he had secured peace for our time. It was a fatal miscalculation. Appeasement didn't calm Hitler down, it fired him up. It convinced him the Western democracies were weak and would never fight. Less than a year later, he broke his promise and seized the rest of Czechoslovakia. Only then did Britain and France finally get it. Hitler's appetite was endless, and his word was worthless. They drew a line in the sand and promised to defend Poland, his obvious next target. On 1st of September 1939, German tanks rolled into Poland. 2 days later, Britain and France declared war on Germany. The 20-year truce was over. The Second World War had begun. The line from the Hall of Mirrors in 1919 to the invasion of Poland in 1939 is a tragic but straight one. It's a powerful lesson in how the best intentions can go horribly wrong. If you found this dive into history's domino effects interesting, make sure you subscribe and hit that notification bell so you don't miss what's next. And let me know in the comments, do you think the Treaty of Versailles was too harsh? In the end, many historians argue that the Treaty of Versailles failed because it tried to do two opposite things at once: punish Germany and create a lasting peace. It ended up doing neither. It was harsh enough to create a lasting bitterness that fueled extremism, but not harsh enough to stop Germany from eventually acting on it. A punitive peace led to national humiliation. Humiliation opened the door for a demagogue, and that demagogue, empowered by economic disaster and unchecked by a hesitant world, led everyone into an even more terrible war. World War II wasn't some random event. It was, in many ways, the final bloody act of a play that began the day the Great War ended. It's a chilling reminder that peace is more than just the end of a war. It has to be built on justice and stability, and it leaves us with one last nagging question. If the seeds of the last World War were sown in the flawed peace that came before it, what are we ignoring today?